afternoon, everyone. Okay, and welcome. I'd like to welcome our friends who are joining remotely. We're just about to start. It's a beautiful opportunity and occasion for us to get these kind of interactions between scholars and religious leaders, and they will provide us good information to help us in decision makings and to cope with the challenges of our times, COVID. But to steer the activity of today, I will leave us in the good hands of my colleague. This event is organized by the Consortium for Christian-Muslim Dialogue in collaboration with the College of Liberal Arts and Theology Department and other good friends of ours who have supported our events. The last event we had, most of our participants were online. We had over 200 people who had to participate online. It looks like the signs of the times. The virtual world is providing us an alternative universe, so to speak. So I'm glad to leave you in the hands of my colleague, Dr. Jim Swindoll. He's going to come and introduce the different speakers and moderate the Q&A session. Dr. Swindoll, please. Oh, sorry, my name is Marinas. I keep forgetting myself. My name is Marinas Iwuchukwu.
Thank you, Marinas. So this is a great opportunity for us to gather under an issue that really has links to people's faith and their different forms of faith. So it's almost like everybody has to take some stock of how their faith life interacts with a virus, but more than that, with the reality of taking vaccines, which we know is certainly an interesting issue, an important issue. So tonight, we've got two main speakers, and then we'll have a panel that will be comprised of three others, people whom I'll introduce in a moment for both sides here. But then we'll have a pretty robust discussion, I think, and that's really what this is meant to be. That we need to know a little bit about the science, a little bit about the vaccine, and I think then we can have a good discussion about various faith perspectives with regard to this. But the interesting thing here is that this is not going away. When we first planned this thing, we were thinking, gosh, we have to really have it quickly, maybe in March or something, because maybe the vaccine is going to go away. And the virus, well, as of last week, we know that Georgetown University just put back their mask mandate for all their students. So this is going to be with us. But the other thing is that it has affected everybody. Everyone in the world has been affected by the virus. And everyone in the world has had to have some stock taken of their relationship to the vaccine. This is we're all in this together. No matter where you live, what continent, the vaccine is prevalent, or the virus is prevalent, and the vaccine brings up its own issues. So our first speaker tonight is Professor Lauren Odonnell. She's professor of pharmacology at Duquesne in the pharmacy school. Dr. Odonnell is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Pharmaceutical Sciences and holds a BS degree in agriculture from the University of Delaware. Professor Odonnell has published at least 20 papers since 2006 and has received 2 NIH research grants in addition to several other grants and awards. Her lab studies interaction between neurotropic viruses, infected neurons, and infiltrating immune cells in the brain. Specifically, it addresses how the adaptive immune response impacts on neurodevelopment during neonatal infections of the central nervous system. Her research thus overlaps with how immune response emerges and fights with infectious disease, thus illustrating the science of how viral disease emerge and how vaccines are developed and utilized. We're grateful for her joining us today to speak about the science involved in viruses and their treatment. So, Professor Odonnell, thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Jim, and thank you for coming today. It's a real pleasure to come here to talk about something near and dear to my heart, which is viruses, and also to interact with these panelists and audience. I'm very excited to do so. But my task for the next 30 minutes is to introduce you to COVID as a disease, and to introduce you to the vaccines and a little bit of their history and how they work. And when Jim initially told Mike and I that we would each have 30 minutes, we were like, how are we going to fill 30 minutes each? And then we started doing it, and we realized, oh no, we need way more time. But we're going to try to keep it concise and keep it on track here. So just to start off, as I mentioned, viruses, I've been studying them now for 20 years at least, which blows my mind. But they are hijackers. They are the ultimate parasite. And unlike a lot of other pathogens, what they do is they take over our cells. And actually, in this picture here, the cell is in green, and all those little yellow dots are coronaviruses that are budding off of the surface, that are going on to infect another cell. And they take over our cells. That's their job. And viruses can't grow by themselves. They are utterly dependent on our cells in order to do anything whatsoever. And here you can see some healthy cells. And if you give them some of the coronavirus, what you see in the red and the green is they're completely filled with viral proteins now. And what's essentially happened here is that the virus has gone inside and it's completely taken over the cell. And what it does is it turns the cell into a little factory. And that factory pumps out viruses. And in doing so, that virus makes the cell very sick, because the cell can no longer do its normal job, and instead it dedicates all of its resources to making new viruses. And those cells may be sick, they may stop working, and they may even die in some cases. So viruses really take advantage of us in order to do their thing. Now, what fascinates me is that most viruses actually come from animals, and most infectious diseases, for that matter rather, are actually originate with animals and cross over into people. And this is a consistent theme that we've seen with viruses in particular. HIV, Ebola, Zika, influenza virus, and now SARS COV2, which is the virus in question today, all crossed over from animal species. And with coronaviruses, that's actually very well understood. The very first coronavirus was actually discovered here in the US in the 1930s on a poultry farm, I believe in Iowa, actually. So coronaviruses have actually been with us for a while. And what's happened over time is that sort of periodically, new coronaviruses have emerged and crossed from animals into people. Now, for a long time, they only kind of led to like a common cold. In fact, everyone gets a cold every year pretty much, right? Very often that's a coronavirus that's doing that. And the initial coronaviruses were kind of not as serious as what we're talking about today. But then things started to change. And what started to happen is that we started to see these more pathogenic coronaviruses, or these viruses that were more capable of causing really serious, deadly disease in people. And this has happened a few times now. It first happened in 2003 with SARS COV1. It happened in 2012 with MERS, that's Middle Eastern Respiratory Virus, and also now SARS COV2. And they each took a slightly different path through different species to land in the human population. But they are out there. They are circulating in animal species, and then we interact with them, and they become ours. So then, what about SARS COV2 in particular? So obviously, you don't need me to tell you that this disrupted things a bit. We were all sent home, and things closed down. But what I hope to tell you today is that in these 2 years, we've actually learned a fair amount about this virus, even though there's a long way to go in our understanding. And what we do know is part of the reason that SARS CoV2 was initially so scary was that it's more transmissible and it's more deadly than even the flu. That was our benchmark. That's still true. And we know now that it's a respiratory virus. And I mention that because that was a little bit controversial initially. It took folks a while to say, this is past to be the respiratory route. That matters because that tells you about what we have to think about in terms of how we interact with each other and how we protect ourselves and each other. We know those things. One thing that I find really astounding about SARS-CoV-2 that just really continues to blow my mind is where it can go in our body. You know, I think everyone thinks of it as a respiratory illness, you know, where you get cold-like symptoms and you might get pneumonia and you have trouble breathing and sneezing and all of that. That's certainly true. It infects our lungs, but it infects many other parts of our bodies as well. It can infect the heart and cause really profound cardiac damage. We know that it enters the brain, and we are just beginning to understand the disruptions that it's causing there. And it appears to enter many other organs as well. We see it in the kidneys, we see it in the GI tract. So what's really just, to my mind, a little disturbing and a little bit scary about SARS-CoV-2 is how well it interacts with our tissues and how well it infects us in so many different parts of our body. And then because of that, the diseases that we see, or the symptoms rather, that people develop fit with that, with various disorders and issues popping up in multiple organ systems. And just a few of them are shown here with CNS complications, so foggy, sort of that foggy brain, trouble thinking. Loss of taste and smell is considered neurological. Certainly a greater risk of heart disease, kidney issues, even erectile dysfunction more recently due to issues with the vasculature. So it tells us really that this is really a multi-organ virus. It attacks really throughout the body. So then, you know, for something like that, for something that can be so profound and can interact so completely with our body in that way, one thing that I find sometimes also a little surprising is how sometimes I think folks feel dismissive of it. And I don't know if we're all just tired of COVID, which I get completely. But you know, one thing to recognize is that SARS-CoV-2 can cause illness in anyone. That's what I'm trying to get across there. So it is certainly true that some folks are at higher risk than others. We know that. The older you are, the greater your risk. That's a very clear risk factor. There are certain conditions that make your risk of severe disease higher. That's certainly the case. But what I think is really important to understand is that it doesn't mean that there isn't risk for other age groups and for people who might be seemingly healthy or for the very young. I can't tell you how many times I've had folks come up and say, oh, you know, something about their kid or their nephew or their cousins, you know, little kids saying, oh, but it doesn't matter, they're going to be fine. And I'm like, ooh, are you sure? And I don't mean that to be scary, but I actually really, we don't know the answer to that question quite yet. And certainly, it's something that we have to keep in mind, that this virus doesn't really spare anyone, really, though severe disease is more associated with these particular conditions. So then, what's going on here? Why is SARS-CoV-2 so bad? Like, what's all the problem? Certainly, it infects multiple parts of your body, but there's a whole other side to this, and that's our immune system. And I don't necessarily mean for us to take all of this in, but what this slide is showing you is lots of different parts of the immune system. We have different cells. They release different factors, different inflammatory mediators. And when we think about how our immune system interacts with COVID, what we realize is that our immune system is having a hard time, a really hard time. And all of the things on this slide, what's essentially happening is that during COVID, they are dysregulated. And what's astounding to me is how widespread this is across multiple immunological measures. where the way that virus interacts with our immune system really throws our immune system into disarray. And that, we think, is part of the reason that we see so much disease in these various parts of the body. Not only can the virus go there, but our immune system, which should be defending us, is having a really hard time getting a hold of that virus, managing it, and getting it under control. It's not something that our immune system is doing especially well. And that's where a lot of the disease seems to come from. And what that's turning into is not only perhaps, the severe COVID that we all think about, that infection that puts people in the hospital, that's very dramatic, very life-threatening, but it's also leading to a whole other population of patients that we are just beginning to understand. And those patients, we would say they have long COVID. There's multiple labels for this, but what we know is that what long COVID seems to be is that folks aren't necessarily recovering that well from this infection. They have a wide variety of different symptoms that linger for weeks to months after they have supposedly recovered from that virus. And what I will tell you is that we don't really understand why this is. We know that it involves multiple parts of the body, just like COVID can go to multiple parts of your body. But we are beginning to understand that a lot of what's wrong is that sort of messed up immune system, that confused immune response, is playing out long term. And it's contributing to this extended period of symptoms. And what's worth noting is that this isn't just in folks who have severe COVID. It's in folks who also have mild COVID, who maybe just had, the runny nose manifestation of it. We are seeing long COVID even in those situations as well. So, on top of all of this, so we have this multi-organ system disease. It's a disease that throws our immune system into disarray, and that disarray allows the disease to persist. And what we're seeing in this context is that this has given the virus a lot of opportunity to grow and to change and to evolve. So viruses mutate a lot. That's kind of part of their deal. It's part of what keeps us on our toes with them. They're always changing. And SARS COV2 is no exception. It's doing that too. Though actually not even as fast as we would have predicted based on how it replicates, but it's doing it nonetheless. And what we're seeing with COVID, or SARS COV2, is that it's becoming way more infectious. That's how it seems to be changing with time. And if you look at the original SARS COV2, so thinking back, how many of you have heard of R0? Is that a familiar phrase? Okay, yeah, a lot of you have. What it tells you is if you imagine the yellow dot in the middle is one sick person, the R0, that number tells you how many other people you would expect to be infected from that one individual. It's basically a measure of how infectious a virus is. And initially, the R0 for SARS CoV2 hit around 2.5. That's a pretty healthy number. That means that it's really going to move through the population. If we fast forward to the version of Omicron that went through earlier this winter, it is now up, depending on the prediction, to be between 8 to 10, meaning one person can infect, we'll say on average, around 9 other people. What that tells you is that SARS-CoV-2 is behaving like viruses do. Viruses, all they want to do, do they want anything? Probably not. They don't actually want to kill you. That's not their end game. What they are trying to do is they are trying to spread and they are trying to replicate. And what happens is that mutations that help the virus do that, they end up spreading, and they spread like wildfire, unfortunately. And so now we have this very, very infectious version of SARS-CoV-2, and we only see that R0 number continuing to climb, which is, again, that's just the virus being the virus. That's what it does. So that puts us then, as of this morning, this is from Johns Hopkins. They keep a running tracker. They've done so since the start of the pandemic. And I will say the total cases is probably an underestimate because with all the at-home testing, not everything's getting reported. But, we're getting up there in cases and over 6 million deaths. So this virus has really moved through us, has moved through the human population, and it's done so very effectively. So then, is there any good news? This virus it's a good virus. It does its thing, right? But guess what? In the last 2 years, we've developed some tools to help us out, and we have a number of them which can be combined in different ways. We have masks, which are quite effective. This is a respiratory virus after all. It's passed in droplets. Masks work. We know to improve ventilation when we have the chance. Again, it's airborne. Moving that air can help. We have at-home tests, though I would argue not enough of them and not enough free ones. These tests do help us recognize when we're likely to be infectious and can help people make a judgment call about when they should be interacting with others. We do have some drugs for COVID now. We have some therapies. They are limited. There's only a handful, but they're here and more are on the way. And then, of course, we also have COVID vaccines. And that is what I've been asked to kind of expand upon for you today. So let's just start off with what do you need to do if you're going to make a vaccine? Pressure's on, right? There's a worldwide pandemic. What can you get out the door? So this is our virus. This is SARS COV2. And what I'm going to point out to you is one piece of the virus that I would really like you to remember for our conversation. You see this little pink guy sticking off here? That's the spike protein. That's on the surface. This virus absolutely needs that spike protein to work if it's going to infect anything. That protein is critical to it. And what's kind of interesting is how folks seem to know the spike protein now. It's sort of a term that's out there. How many of you knew what the spike was? A number of you. Yeah, we know this now, which is actually, as a virologist, really fun for me, because I don't have to explain as much terminology. But here's our virus. And what we've done in the past, we have a lot of good vaccines, but we had some pretty, standard ways that we did it. You could take the whole virus and modify it. You could make it a little weaker, so that it wouldn't cause disease, but that it would mimic an infection. You could take that virus and you could inactivate it so that your body had a chance to see the whole virus, could learn what it looked like, but without the risk of disease. We have things called virus-like particles, which are really cool, and they're just the shell of the virus. There's nothing inside them. So they can't infect you, they can't cause disease, but from the outside, it looks just like a real virus, and it tricks our immune response into learning it. And you can also break that virus up into pieces and use just little individual pieces to have your immune system kind of learn to recognize what's there. Now, the rub with all of these is that in order to sort of design one and produce one, it takes a fair amount of money and it takes a fair amount of time. And there are a number of reasons for that, kind of in thinking about how these different things are produced and what you have to sort of figure out to get there. Well, with SARS, we didn't have a lot of time necessarily. So that led us then to think about some different approaches. And what that leaves us with are kind of two general options now for COVID vaccines. We have those mRNA vaccines, one's from Pfizer, one's from Moderna. And we also have what we would call a viral vector vaccine. This is where you use, this is from Johnson & Johnson, use a virus that has been stripped down so it cannot replicate, it cannot cause disease in and of itself, but you use it as a shuttle to deliver the information for the spike protein. I'm actually not going to talk too much about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, though we can certainly talk about it further. I'm going to focus a little more on the mRNA vaccines. The reason for that is that these seem to be favored with boosting now, and I think we're kind of going more towards that direction. But we can always talk about that as well. So then these mRNA vaccines, how do they work? And how do we know they work? So, okay, imagine you have a cell, and I promise I'm not gonna get too biochemistry crazy here. But if you have a cell and that cell has DNA, what happens is that DNA can be used as messenger RNA, and that is our mRNA. And messenger RNA, it's like a Post-it note. It's basically something, like, you know how you take a Post-it note, you need to remember something, so you write it down and you slap it on your desk. You do it and you throw it out, right? Or if you're me, sometimes the Post-it notes stick up there for 7 years, and you're like, I should probably take the Post-it note down. But I don't think most people do that. I think most people just throw out their Post-it notes. That's what messenger RNA is like. It's a note to the cell saying, hey, you need to make this. Once it's made, you throw out the Post-it note and it's done. And so in the case of messenger RNA, you use that to actually make proteins. And cells do this all day long. This is part of the normal job of a cell. This is going on in your body consistently, constantly. It's happening now too. So then, how do the mRNA vaccines take advantage of this? So what we're doing with an mRNA vaccine is we are asking our bodies to basically make the protein of the virus for us, instead of having to produce it somewhere in a factory. We're asking our cells to do a little bit of work. And so if here's our mRNA vaccine, and it's basically a little droplet of fat that protects the mRNA in the middle, that's blue, and that little fat droplet delivers the mRNA into your cell. And I'm not very good at animation, so that is the delivery right there, and how your mRNA is in the cell. And what that encodes for, what that gives the cell the information to do, is to make the spike protein. And so that cell starts making a bunch of that spike protein, just like if it was an infected cell. Except it's not infected, right? It just has a spike protein, that's all, just temporarily. But what that does is that attracts our immune response. Our immune response is constantly sampling the surface of our cells, looking for anything out of the ordinary, looking for anything that seems out of line. And that spike protein looks quite out of line to our immune cells. They see it as foreign. They start the whole extensive process of generating an immune response, and that gives you antibodies against that spike protein. And antibodies are great. They're not the only part of the immune system that are worth talking about, but I'm going to limit myself to them today. Antibodies are great. They are going to help you stop that virus. So let's say then you do encounter the virus and it enters your system. If you already have those antibodies, what's beautiful about that is they will coat the surface of that virus. And when the surface of the virus is coated with antibodies, it is neutralized, meaning that it cannot get into your cell any longer. It's like it's blocking the doorknob. It can't interact with your cells anymore, and it's physically blocked. And therefore, if it can't get into our cells, it can't replicate, and infection is stopped, ideally. So that was the whole idea behind these. But one thing that seemed to cause a lot of consternation, and that I still have some conversations with folks about, is how on earth how can we know that this is okay? This seemed really, really fast. And you know what? It was fast. That's true. It's the fastest we have ever made a vaccine, in about a year. But there are reasons for that. And I would actually propose is that it wasn't random. It was because we were incredibly lucky and ready that these mRNA vaccines made it out the door as quick as they did. So just part of the reason this happened so fast is that this mRNA technology is not especially new. These folks here, this is Drew Weissman and Caitlin Carrico, they have been studying RNA as a therapeutic since 2000. That's when their first paper came out. So they have been tweaking and working on this for over 20 years. Drew Weissman is an immunologist, and Caitlin is a biochemist. And together, they've spent 2 decades figuring out how to make the RNA work for us in this platform, and working through all the nitty-gritty of how to make it safe, how to make it work, how to get it expressed. And because there was all this history, the mRNA vaccines had already gone through initial clinical trials for other viruses, for HIV, for Zika, amongst others. So what we already had when COVID started was this sort of nice body of literature about the safety and the approaches for an mRNA vaccine. And what's also really beautiful about these vaccines is we call them plug and play. It's really easy, relatively, to make a little strand of mRNA and to adjust it and to make it for your virus of choice. And it's faster, it's easier, it's cheaper. Probably the people that make it would not say it's easy. But I would say relatively, I propose that it is. And you can do this without making any infectious virus. Now, on top of that, remember from the beginning of the talk, we looked at all those other coronaviruses that have emerged in recent years. And it became apparent, I think, to a lot of folks that there were going to be more coronaviruses. And one of those people was Kizzmekia Corbett. And what she did well before COVID was she took that mRNA platform that Drew and Caitlin have been working on, and she made an mRNA vaccine for Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus, or MERS. That was the coronavirus that hit before SARS COV2 did. And so she made it. She had it all worked out. She was in initial safety trials. She had it all together before COVID even started. And she called this the prototype pathogen approach, which is a term that I love. And all it's saying is we're going to be ready for the next one. And we're going to pretend like another one's coming. And that's what she did. And the Moderna vaccine is the result of her work. She's one of the co-inventors. She was even a part of a question on Jeopardy. So you know if you made it that far that you're doing something right. So the idea I'm trying to get across here, and these are just a few of the people involved, but we were very lucky in that much of the groundwork had already been laid. So this didn't come out of nowhere. On top of that, because time was of the essence, the way that sort of the planning for clinical trials went, was altered a bit. Typically, it takes 5 to 10 years to go from the start to release. The way that things were accelerated for COVID, it was not to, what I want to stress, it was not, no safety benchmarks were changed. Safety benchmarks were held where they were. Individual phases of clinical trials were held at the same length as you would for any other vaccine. But what they did to make things move along is a lot of this early part where you're tinkering with things in the lab, that was already managed. In fact, Kizzmekia had 5 days after the sequence was released for SARS COV2 in January 2020, she already had that in mice doing the initial preclinical trials. That's how quick she went. But they were able to shorten that. They were able to overlap phases of the clinical trial. You wouldn't normally do that just for financial reasons, because these trials are expensive. But this was the time to spend the money, so we kept the trials moving. And then also, at risk, the manufacturing started early. So we didn't wait. We got it, we were sort of hopeful that it would work out and started making it early, so as soon as those clinical trials were done, it could move forward. So then, we now have these vaccines. And what I think I probably said too quickly is that they have been vetted, they have been studied, they've gone through the normal hoops that we normally would do for any other vaccine. So then why do we vaccinate? There are some very obvious reasons for personally, for selfishly, why you may want to. What we know is it protects against severe illness, it protects against death, it reduces your risk of catching it in the first place. It also cuts your risk of long COVID in half if you do happen to catch it. So it takes everything down a notch. And it also allows you to protect others. If more folks are vaccinated, it allows us to shield the most vulnerable in our population. That includes folks who are immunocompromised. It includes young kids who cannot be vaccinated. And probably a lot of you have heard of herd immunity. The more of us that are vaccinated, the more of a block that puts against the virus. It stops the virus from moving so effectively through the population. And when we have that, when we get that sort of level of immunity in the population, that slows COVID down and it stops it from sort of progressing and evolving like it has been. And so today, we actually have a lot of people vaccinated too. We have a long way to go because this represents doses, and you need two. If not the boost, which I would argue, if you want to talk about that, boosting is great. So we're not there yet. We have a lot of people we need to reach, I would propose. So then, just to end, has anyone seen Encanto? Does this scene mean, yeah. What else can we do? I think these mRNA technologies are really going to take us forward. And they are currently in clinical trials for many other diseases. And I suspect that their impact in the long term is going to be huge, not just for SARS, but for disease in general. So we'll see how that plays out. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Lauren. I learned more there than I've learned in 2 years about the virus, so thank you so much. Our other speaker will be Professor Mike Seaman. Mike is an associate professor of biological sciences here at Duquesne in the Baer School of Natural and Environmental Sciences. He did his Ph.D. in biological anthropology at Yale. In 2002, he received it, a postdoc at the University of Chicago in ecology and evolution, and another postdoc in genomics at the Medical College of Wisconsin. Among his primary areas of study is evolutionary genetics. He's been a co-organizer of the Darwin Day here at Duquesne, which is an annual symposium that deals with issues of evolution. Dr. Seaman has numerous publications in the areas of genetic studies of mitochondrial DNA and genomes of various animals. Dr. Seaman has also taught courses on science and religion, and most recently while teaching at Duquesne's Rome campus, where he was able to spend those wonderful months in Rome while teaching science and religion. He will present a layman's model of the vaccine and what are the general religious kind of implications for certain people from that. And these with the intent of understanding the prevention and cure that's involved with the virus, which also has social ramifications. So with great joy, we have Mike also to join Lauren in giving us the second speaker here. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that introduction, and thank you, Marius, for inviting me to be a part of this. Being at a university, so often we don't talk across to other schools, even colleagues in the building next door. So great to be a part of this. If for any reason, just to meet more people in the liberal arts college and the pharmacy school. And so thank you for that. Glad to be here. I should first, I guess, point out what I am not. I'm not a theologian, and I don't claim to be one. And so I will be talking about a few different religions and probably get things wrong because that's not my job. What I am is someone who has a long interest in the relationship between science and religion, and a historical perspective, as well as contemporary issues. And that stems from the fact that I'm an evolutionary biologist. I work in a field where a large number of people in the world, including a large number of Americans, basically don't believe my science because of their religion. And so I'm very used to thinking about finding common ground and dealing with issues or conflicts, we should say. And so thinking a little bit about kind of a history of conflicts in religion, the first thing I often think about, again, as an evolutionary biologist, think about Darwin's theory of evolution and how the initial reaction by some religious leaders and the continuing opposition by some religions to Darwin's explanation for the diversity of life on Earth Going back a little further in time, and as Jim mentioned, I had the good fortune of spending time on Rome's campus and teaching about religion and science and conflicts. And one of the great, another sort of great historical example was, here we see an image of Galileo being put on trial by the church for promoting the Copernicus view of the universe, that the sun, in fact, is the center of the solar system, that the earth is not the center. And in these historical contexts, that's sort of the framework I was kind of used to thinking about the conflicts. In these cases, we sort of envision sort of a, well, truth versus truth. That is, there's different ways of understanding the world, different ways of coming up with truths of the world, one coming from religion, from sacred text, one coming from empirical study of the world through science. And in these examples, you know, depending on how the story gets told, it's often told as sort of a battle, and then in the end, well, science wins. Turns out the sun does not revolve around the earth. Science won. I think that's kind of a simplistic message. I think the bigger issue here is maybe, as Pope John Paul II said, when you have different ways of trying to understand the same thing, he said, truth cannot contradict truth. We have truths from the Bible, we have truths from our other sacred texts, we have truth from science, and we got to figure it out, how to resolve that conflict. I don't think the current discussion of vaccine hesitancy is really in the same vein here. It's not really different ways of trying to understand the world. So I actually don't think there's too much to gain from this historical perspective with these guys, but I happen to like those examples. So let's think about how we can sort of conceptualize or put into a framework our discussion today for the purposes of thinking about potential conflict or issues between religion and science. And I can kind of think, I know the title of the symposium is Vaccine Hesitancy. I'd like to at least have my glass be half full and also think about vaccine acceptance. And so thinking about, if we look broadly across all religions, religious motivations for accepting vaccine, for taking the vaccine and encouraging others, as well as religious motivation for not wanting the vaccine or being resistant or hesitant to it. And so I'll kind of go through these one by one with some examples. It's probably a near universal amongst all religions, at least among the big three that we're talking about today, the big three monotheistic religions of the Middle East. The importance of life, the sanctity of life, the importance of preserving life, of saving life, perhaps above all else, that it's incumbent upon us, and furthermore, that whether it's coming from the Jewish, the Muslim, or the Christian perspective, this understanding that the preservation of life sort of supersedes other laws or ideas that we may have, that if there's a conflict between laws, that the one that supports life or saves life is sort of supersedes those laws. We see that here in the two examples, and I could just add, I didn't have it as a quote here, but similar vein in the Christian New Testament, and I'll forget the details, I think it's Luke. Jesus is sort of accused of working on the Sabbath, and he says, but I'm saving. He was healing people. And a reminder that supersedes other laws, that you know, it's okay if you're in the business of saving lives. Another, you know, kind of related concept, but the importance of religious reasons for accepting the vaccine, and this is sort of touched upon by Dr. Odonnell, and that is we do have a duty to our fellow humans. And I think this is expressed pretty well by Pope Francis. As you can see the quote here, he described getting the vaccine as an act of love, as it's sort of a gift to your fellow man, to your fellow human. And beyond that, we have a duty to help not just our fellow people, but the least of our people, the most vulnerable, the poorest, the sick. And I could find a lot of different quotes from all the religious texts to support that. But this idea of caring for the less fortunate is common to at least all the religions that we're hearing today. And we see that through extension, charities, all religions involved in creating charities often to provide health care for the less fortunate, and so on. And I think it's part of this when we think about the things we do to protect others, vaccines, masks, whatever it may be. In many cases, we're not just protecting our loved ones, our family, our friends, we're protecting the older woman at the grocery store that we don't know. And of course, then this recalls the story from the New Testament of the Good Samaritan, where the message is, you're not just supposed to love your family and your friends and care for the people you know. Caring for strangers in need is equally important. And so, well, that's great. We have, seems a wide variety of religious reasons, or at least some strong religious reasons for everyone to get the vaccine. But I have 22 more minutes to talk, so we should probably talk about people who are coming from the same faiths, the same perspectives, relying on the same sacred texts, but coming to different conclusions and arguing a religious basis for rejecting getting a vaccine. And give a few sort of, if we lump all the different arguments or all the different objections to vaccination, we kind of lump them in a few different categories. And we can think of one, I would sort of describe it as our body is sacred, described in a variety of different ways. Our bodies are a gift from God. We have a duty to treat our body as a temple. And therefore, we don't put in bad substances when we teach kids in their religious education as youth. We sometimes use this as a reason to tell our children, don't do drugs, don't do alcohol. Your body is a temple. It's a gift from God. We're made in God's image. And therefore, the argument that some would there take is this vaccine is bad, it's dangerous, it contains things I don't know what's in it, I'm fearful of it, and rationalizing by claiming that body is a temple, and therefore it would violate their perceptions as their body being sacred by accepting the vaccine. Getting a little more specific, maybe related to that, is some objections of receiving a vaccine because of specific content of that vaccine, or as we'll see in a second, origins of those vaccines. I don't have any quotes here. We're probably all familiar with kosher and halal or dietary regulations on consuming pork and blood and roadkill. But pork products are used in biotechnology. We do use it in a few instances. If you learn about, if you're a scientist in biotechnology, molecular biology, we actually steal a lot of our tools from the natural world. We take enzymes from bacteria, enzymes from plants and other products from plants and animals. And during routine cell culture in growing cells in petri dishes, we use trypsin, which I've used for 20 years, and I never actually thought about where it came from until a couple days ago as I was looking into this. Most of the trypsin we use in cell culture comes from pork because it's the cheapest way to get trypsin. It's an enzyme that when we grow cells on a petri dish, it helps them detach from the petri dish by sort of chewing up the proteins that would connect them to the petri dish. Similarly, collagen is sometimes used as a stabilizing agent in vaccine preparation, in freeze drying, things like that, to make it stable for storage. The cheapest way to get collagen is usually from pigs, including gelatin as a food source we might be familiar with. I've had several vegetarian friends throughout my life shocked when they realized that gelatin comes from animals. And so, yeah, so that's an issue. And is it a problem? Well, you can look at a couple of examples, or I took some data here from a recent paper. This is a review paper last year, specifically looking at COVID-19 and specifically looking at decisions being made by governing bodies on whether or not there was pork or enough pork to worry about in COVID-19 vaccines, and both the different types of vaccines, the Johnson & Johnson, as well as the mRNA-based vaccines. And I am certainly not an expert in the bureaucracy of any religion, but my understanding, at least from this article, which is written by some Indonesians, had a bit of an Indonesian bias, is that each of these countries have some sort of governing council that makes decisions on whether products or other things are allowed, that is, being halal, or not allowed, haram. And the conclusion was that there's a bunch of different countries listed. I listed larger ones here, all ruling that, in fact, it's fine to take the vaccine, in part because if you think about vaccine production, the purification of that vaccine is so highly purified that by the time you're to the final product, there is no more trypsin. There is no detectable trypsin in those things. Now, I don't think that purification, Dr. Odonnell is the pharmacologist. I'm not an expert in vaccine or drug production, but I don't think the purification is done in order to remove the pork so much as it is that vaccines have to be pure simply for reasons of, like any drug has to be pure. We have to get rid of all the dangerous side effects and so on. Anyway, but in Indonesia, the governing body ruled that there may be traces of pork products left, but it's still allowed to use under this principle that saving a life is more important. There's an urgent need. There's no other option available. There's no other vaccine that could be used right now, so let's allow it. But it does bring back, if we go back in time a little bit, a similar case, also in Indonesia. In 2017, Indonesia embarked upon a campaign, measles, mumps, rubella, and I think a similar conclusion was reached by the council that yeah, there may be pork products left in this vaccine, but it's okay. And most of the provinces, we got to very high vaccination rates. Measles is an incredibly contagious virus. But one of the provinces, Aceh, I'm going to pronounce that wrong, I apologize. A lot of misinformation apparently was spread in that province and very low vaccination rates. So it's sort of really a measles outbreak waiting to happen. Similar situation happened in the United States. In the mid-2010s, misinformation was being spread among the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn. And measles vaccination rates dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped. None of the religious leaders, none of the rabbis, none of the other leaders were opposed to the vaccine, but misinformation was being spread among people, vaccine hesitancy, and then in 2019, one of the worst measles outbreaks in US history occurred with well over 1,000 cases in a fairly small geographic area just in Brooklyn alone. The other aspect of the things that may be in a vaccine or related to the production of a vaccine that have raised some objections based on religious objections is the use of fetal cell lines. There's a few different cell lines that are commonly used in biotechnology and biological research and medical research, in drug development and drug testing. And two of them listed here are the HEC293 cells. These cells were originally obtained from an abortion. Probably, some of the records were lost. It may have been a miscarriage, but most people believe it was an abortion that occurred in 1973 in the Netherlands. Some cells were taken from the kidney of that aborted fetus and turned into a cell line. By a cell line, I mean the cells that we can grow indefinitely in the lab. They're very well characterized, and some cell lines turn out to be more useful than others for research and development. HEC293 cells are a workhorse of modern biomedicine because they're just really good at sort of what they need to be good at. Glossing over they grow fast, they transfect well. Anyway, a different cell line, the PER-C6G, I'm a little less familiar with these cells. These were also obtained from a fetus aborted in 1985, taken from the cells of retina. Now, both of these abortions were legally conducted in countries where abortion was legal at the time. And the abortions were not performed in order to obtain the cells for biomedical research. Their abortions occurred because the mother wanted to have an abortion. And then physician or scientist said, well, let's see if we can get some cells from this and establish a cell line. So what's the concern? The concern is that even though the abortions did not occur in order to make vaccines, the production of the vaccine sort of capitalizes on those events. And if you view abortion as evil or as wrong, then being sort of linked to those events makes the production of the vaccines or the use of the vaccines immoral. I didn't bother to research everyone on their opinions on the use of these cells, but both the Southern Baptists and the Catholics agree that the use of vaccines derived from these cells are in fact fine. And I figure if the Southern Baptists and the Catholics agree on it, I didn't bother to look much farther beyond that. And then part of this is because the idea that, yes, there's a link, there's a historical connection between the vaccines and these cell lines, but if you take the vaccine, in no way will it cause a future abortion. In no way will it cause more abortions. Okay, so what other objections may there be? Objections against vaccines based on religious beliefs? Well, I took this from Vanderbilt University Medical Center, did a comprehensive listing as part of their encouraging people to get the vaccine, and with their long list of religions that have no formal objections, no theological objections to taking the vaccine, and came up with 5 they could find where legitimately may have an objection to the vaccine. You see that among the faiths that have no theological objections include, among the Christian faiths, because that's kind of where we're headed with the objections here, Catholicism, mainstream Protestants, Lutherans, Methodists, Episcopalians, and so forth. And a few that may surprise you were, for instance, Jehovah's Witnesses. Many of us are probably familiar with the observation that Jehovah's Witnesses do not receive blood transfusions, and we may generalize that to think that Jehovah's Witnesses are opposed to modern medicine. That's not true at all. Their opposition to blood transfusions is very specific and related to both the Old and New Testament. The prohibition against taking blood, usually interpreted to mean drinking blood or taking blood as part of a meal, which is part of dietary laws of both Judaism and Islam, not consuming blood, but they take that to also mean not taking blood as a transfusion. But beyond that, they have no objections to modern medicine. The Amish are listed up there as not having a formal objection. Amish have very low vaccination rates for COVID and very high cases in both, if you look through eastern Ohio and Pennsylvania. And so it's what it is. And finally, the Church of Christ Scientists arguably has theological objections. I'm not terribly familiar with the theology of the Church of Christ Scientists, but among their central tenets are the idea that healing comes through God. You pray for healing. You live a healthy lifestyle as ordained by God, and avoiding modern medicine. They do on their website say that they are not opposed to vaccinations, largely statements to the effect that individual members are free to do whatever they want. We encourage those to lead a healthy lifestyle as a means of healing. And I guess related to that, when we think of the Church of Christ Scientists as being healed by faith, again, this is I'm not a member of the church, but my interpretation is more of not a big tent revivalist, lay your hands and someone gets healed instantly and gets out the wheelchair, more of a faith healing in the sense of leading a healthy lifestyle and following the teaching of God, praying for health, part of a lifestyle rather than what one might call faith healing in a different sense. According to Vanderbilt, 5 different Christian faiths do have explicit theological objections. The Dutch Reformed There are Dutch Reformed in the United States, as well as obviously in the Netherlands. The Dutch Reformed are sort of ultra-Calvinists in a sense, and I think their objections to intervening comes from that perspective of strong belief in predestination, and everything in our life is God's will. Who are we to interfere with it? And if I get that wrong, I apologize to any Dutch Reformed in the audience. The last four of these faiths listed are what we might consider classical faith healing. Healing solely by praying, by laying on hands, more of a miraculous faith healing perspective. Not numerically large. So given that nearly all faiths in the United States, and I didn't list the other 4,000 or 5,000 Christian denominations in the U.S., but similar ideas, we often see headlines over the last year as vaccine mandates rolled out, as opposition grew to the vaccine mandates, and most states allow for religious exemptions, a lot of people asking, well, who exactly qualifies for a religious exemption? Or what does my own faith believe? And a lot of headlines from major news sources leading with the idea that really nobody is opposed to this theologically. Therefore, there's no problem. And I guess problem solved. But I think there is a problem. And why is there a problem? I'm not entirely sure, but I don't think these people who are using religious arguments in opposition of vaccines or vaccine mandates, I don't think these people are Dutch Reformed. I don't think they're of those handful of faiths that are consistently and explicitly and historically opposed to vaccines. When vaccine mandates were rolled out in California, 2,000 members of the LA Police Department claimed a religious exemption. I don't think there's 2,000 Dutch Reformed members of the LAPD. So rather, I think what is probably happening, if I had to guess, based on simply being an American, my observation is that a lot of religious people in America sort of form their own beliefs, often in opposition to that is explicitly offered by the leaders of their faith. And I say this in part, again, as an evolutionary biologist, most major religions in the US have no opposition to the theory of evolution, but yet, in my lifetime, I very often will meet Catholics, mainstream Protestants, Lutherans, Episcopalians, whatever, whose church teaches no opposition to the theory of evolution, but yet individual members sort of seem uncomfortable with it. Now, tell them, your church does not, if they're Catholic, let's say the church does not oppose evolution. I guarantee you that Pope Francis, Pope John Paul II, all the recent popes fully understood and accepted evolution as the process that created the diversity of life on Earth. But still retaining some opposition because something they heard from their grandmother or their aunt or something they saw on Facebook. Probably a lot of confirmation bias, I think, also going on. I think another thing that's going on is people rationalizing their beliefs with religion, opposition to the vaccine out of some other nature, political fear of the unknown, opposition of institutions in general, opposition or distrust of government. And rather than saying, I simply distrust the government, couching it in religious terms as a way of rationalizing. I think history in this country has shown that people can rationalize just about anything through religion, including diametrically opposed views. Slavery, for instance. The other thing that may be happening here is, and this is where I'm a little bit pessimistic for the future, in the last recent generation, the commingling of religion and politics and sort of personal identity, I I think a new religion is essentially forming that is taking ideas of politics and religion and sort of bringing it all together. I'm thinking of various memes and Facebook posts with a flag and an eagle and a cross and an assault rifle all mixed together. Anyway, so I don't really know why. I guess that's the question. Maybe that's the question for the audience or for the panel or whoever. Given that almost every religious faith in the U.S. has no theological objections, why do people continuously couch their opposition in religious terms? I don't know. And so just to sort of go back over the few ideas that I mentioned as far as religious reasons to accept the vaccine, religious motivation for not accepting the vaccine. And since I have a few minutes, I thought I would also just take a briefly historical view. One thing that is worth noting that the opposition to vaccination is essentially as old as vaccination itself. The earliest vaccinations by Jenner using cowpox as a means of preventing smallpox were met with ridicule and opposition by some, including some religious objections, largely along the idea of not messing with God's will or your body as a temple and not putting strange things into it. And we kind of see that here. This is from 1802, a cartoon in a pamphlet or a newspaper. And I don't know if you can see this, but what's happening here is as people are getting vaccinated, out of their body is coming cows growing out of their heads and their arms and their faces because we're putting something strange and different into our body. The cowpox, of course, the cowpox comes from cows, but it sort of does. Anyway, point is, it's fear of putting things into your body, which at that time by some were couched in those religious terms. Once this got to the States a little bit later in the 19th century, very quickly in the 1870s, between the 1870s and the 1890s, organized groups started to form. The New England Coalition to oppose vaccination, the New York Anti-Vaccination League, and so on. And if you've paid attention to some of the legal arguments related to vaccine mandates, you may have seen this 1905 case, the Jacobson versus Massachusetts, offered as precedent for, yes, the government does have the authority to mandate vaccines. We may not have realized that Jacobson was a Lutheran minister. And so some of his opposition was coming from his religious background. The history of the anti-vaccination movement also goes back a long way. These are some political cartoons from the 1920s showing the anti-vaxxers walking people over the cliff into a pool or a canyon of smallpox, as it were. Similar, probably stolen from the first one. This is 1924 from North Dakota, I think it was. Dragging the ignorant and the bigots and the careless with their lies into the cliff of smallpox. Well, so what does the future hold? I guess that's where we're hopefully headed, to think about the future. One of the strange things, one of the ironies, the big ironies, I think, of this pandemic is, as Dr. Odonnell explained, the amazing accomplishment of creating a vaccine against something we had never seen before in a matter of months. This is the equivalent of putting a man on the moon, but instead of taking a decade, taking only less than 1 year. It was an incredibly remarkable scientific accomplishment. The end result is, after this pandemic, there will be more vaccine opposition than there was before the pandemic. There's been more organized groups, there's been more motivation, there's been more public outcry, there's been more politicians receptive to the anti-vaccination view. And so at the end of this, we're going to walk out with more laws or relaxation of mandates, probably an increase in the allowance of religious exemptions, of personal exemptions, and probably an increase in organized groups, as well as an increase in the cynical use of it as a wedge issue. It was a wedge issue by politicians in manufactured culture wars. So, but what about religious leaders? What will be the role of religion and our leaders as we move forward in the future? I don't know. That'd be a really good question. I suspect what will happen is we'll see some of our leaders encouraging us, getting back to the reasons why, religious motivations for caring for your fellow human, for the sanctity of life. I suspect there will also be religious leaders involved in the opposition as well. And as always, diametrically opposed views being justified by religion and often by the same religion. So, thank you for your time. Hate to end on a pessimistic note, but I am who I am. And so now I guess we'll turn it over to, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike and Lauren. Those were incredibly detailed and appropriate, and took a lot of time to put those together. I really appreciate that for this discussion that we're having. So why don't we gather now? What I think we'll do is have all 5 of you, and I'll introduce, sit down over there. You can move the camera over, of course. If you could just, that'll be our discussion table over there, so all 5 of you. But what we'll do is, if each of the 3 of the new, I'll introduce each of the 3 panelists and ask you to give a few comments of your own at the beginning, and then the question and answers will emerge from that. So we're all in this as question and answer period, but if each of you can kind of introduce yourselves beyond my little introduction and formulate questions, but also you're all part of the answer. All of you are part of the answers and questions. So just to introduce each panelist. Okay, Michael Deem. Yeah, if you just, that's Michael. He joined the University of Pittsburgh in the fall of 2001 with an appointment as associate professor in the Department of Human Genetics in the Graduate School of Public Health. Previously, he was an assistant professor here at Duquesne with a joint appointment in the School of Nursing and the Center for Healthcare Ethics. Dr. Deem completed his Ph.D. in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame in 2015 and an MA in philosophy at Texas A&M University in 2009, as well as an MA in historical theology at St. Louis University in 2005. He completed a postdoctoral fellowship in pediatric ethics and genomics at Children's Mercy Hospital and clinics in Kansas City. Dr. Deem's main interests of research are bioethics, philosophy of biology, and medicine, and interprofessional healthcare ethics education. Imam Chris Caras, on the end there, of Peoria, Illinois, is a convert to Islam who attained Islamic studies degrees from universities in Saudi Arabia and in Malaysia. He then worked in outreach for several Islamic organizations in St. Louis. Since 2019, Imam Caras has been the religious director of the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh. As director, he values, quote, the benefits of interfaith dialogue and cross-cultural conversations, unquote, and has been very much involved with activities here at Duquesne, of which we are very grateful. He is married with 3 children. Rabbi Seth Adelson has served as a senior rabbi at Congregation Beth Shalom in Pittsburgh since 2015. He spent the previous 8 years as an associate rabbi of Temple Israel of Great Neck on Long Island. Prior to that, he served for 4 years as cantor at the Conservative Synagogue of Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. He was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City in 2007, having received cantorial investiture and an MA in Bible and Ancient Semitic Languages there in 2004. For that, he worked as a chemical engineer for 5 years and holds a BS in chemical engineering from Cornell University and an MS from Texas A&M. He and his wife, Judith, have 2 children. Michael, I think you have children too. You didn't yet mention, but yeah, I couldn't find that on the internet. But thanks. Okay, so what we'll do is, why don't we just go in your order of seating, start with you, Michael. The three of you first is kind of introduce and make any comments on what you've heard so far, and then the questions, if we could just have the initial questions just from within the panelists, and we'll open it up to the audience later. Okay?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Thanks very much for hosting me and my co-panelists. So I am not an ordained minister, nor am I responsible for congregation. I do identify as a Catholic. I am a candidate in the Diocese of Pittsburgh's diaconate program, but you know, they always say God willing, but I also say Bishop willing, right? So I would be ordained sometime from now. I say that just as background. I think it's best and most prudent for me to make just a few brief remarks on what I think is the correct interpretation of what the Catholic Church's teaching body, known as the Magisterium, has said about vaccines generally and the COVID-19 vaccine specifically. And so I'll offer that not as the all-encompassing Catholic perspective, but rather what have sort of authoritative documents issued by the Magisterium said about these vaccines. And I'll talk briefly, a few remarks briefly, about vaccine mandates in the Catholic Church. And then I'll make one statement, maybe an answer to Mike's kind of closer, what's the future hold, and what's motivating these objections. I have a theory, at least among most Catholic, very vocal Catholic objections to the COVID-19 vaccines, which I'll share. Let me break this sort of Catholic perspective on the Magisterium's teachings into 2 parts. One, the fetal cell line issue, which I'm grateful to Mike for already introducing, so we don't have to rehearse, the details of where those cell lines were derived. But that is the main ethical issue that the Catholic Church's teaching body has addressed. So if there's a major moral problem with the COVID-19 vaccines from a Catholic perspective, that's probably the sticking point. So what has the Catholic Church had to say about vaccines that were tested, developed, and were manufactured utilizing fetal cell lines that were derived from the tissue of aborted fetuses? So as Mike noted, these were abortions that happened decades ago, and these cell lines are derived from tissue from those aborted fetuses. And so presently, right, we are billions and billions of iterations of replications away from that original procured tissue. And so it's very remote temporally, but I think also in terms of any sort of direct connection to that initial tissue from which those cell lines were derived. This is an old issue for Catholics. COVID-19 did not make this suddenly a question. I think that social media has really amplified some very fringe, and I would argue incorrect voices, ranging from bishops like Bishop Strickland in Texas to very vocal pro-life advocates like Abby Johnson. And social media has granted them a larger platform than, say, would have been done in 2003 when the Catholic Church first weighed in on this particular question. What is the moral status of the act of accepting a vaccine that has some connection to these past abortions? So in 2003, the Vatican received an inquiry from the United States from a parent advocacy group that was concerned about the morality, the permissibility of accepting the rubella vaccine for their children. Now, the rubella vaccine wasn't developed or manufactured utilizing the two cell lines that Mike had mentioned. He had mentioned that there were other cell lines utilized. I believe the rubella cell line was the WI-38, which also, I think, has an origin in a 1960s abortion. There's also the MRC5 line for some other vaccines that are used. But given that the rubella vaccine has this link to a past abortion, what's the moral status of the action for a Catholic of accepting it for their child? And as those of you who know how the bureaucratic machinery of the Vatican works, it took 2 full years before a response was given. The major doctrinal body, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, kicked it down to a subsidiary called the Pontifical Academy for Life. The leader of the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, at the time was a fellow named Joseph Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI, so this was issued under his watch. And the summary of that decision from the Vatican was that although abortion, of course, from the Catholic perspective, is intrinsically evil, meaning that no act of abortion under any circumstances can be morally justified, the connection between the reception of the vaccine and that original act of abortion is so remote that under certain circumstances it can be permissible to accept that vaccine. What would those circumstances be? Well, promoting and contributing to the common good, as Mike mentioned. What's the common good? Well, according to the church, the common good is the sum total of those conditions in which individuals may pursue well-being and flourish. Ideally, then, the common good also involves health and well-being. And so in the presence of a risky pathogen that can cause quite a bit of illness, in the case of rubella, there's also a risk to fetuses, and even death, that those values of the common good outweigh any moral problem attached to the very remote connection between the vaccine and the past abortion. That was the statement. That was reaffirmed in 2008 by the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith in an official document called Dignitatis Personae. And then it was reiterated again in 2017 by the Pontifical Academy of Life in response to some inquiry from the Italian bishops about another vaccine that had fetal cell line connections. What's the sum of the story? The sum of the story is that the Catholic Church had a very well worked out position on vaccines and the permissibility of accepting vaccines tied to fetal cell lines well before the pandemic. So when COVID-19 hit, and when we were right on the cusp of having an effective and relatively safe vaccine available, the Catholic Church weighed in again. Mike mentioned the USCCP document from December 2020. The Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith issued a statement concurrently in December 2020, and basically just applied the same framework that was developed in response to the rubella vaccine inquiry to the COVID-19 vaccines. So again, when the risk to individual and community health is serious, and it certainly was in December 2020 with COVID-19, and accepting the vaccine can effectively promote the common good, then that outweighs any moral problem associated, again, with participation in some remote way in the illicit abortion and posthumous derivation of tissue that was used to develop the cell line. So that's sort of the basic position that the magisterium of the church put out in response to the COVID-19 vaccines. Right now, presently, we are still in April 2022 with 3 vaccines that either have full FDA approval or are still under emergency use authorization. So there's the Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson vaccines. All 3 have connections to fetal cell lines, as Mike noted. It doesn't look like there's anything on the horizon. It's already a pretty crowded vaccine market here. And, maybe the Novavax vaccine is the next one up. I think it's in phase 3 clinical trials at this point. It's a sub-protein unit vaccine, so it's more traditional delivery. So that may assuage concerns about the spookiness of mRNA. But it was also, like the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, tested and developed utilizing fetal cell lines. So it looks like this is going to be an issue for Catholics in the US and probably worldwide for the long term that may not be resolved. However, I will say this, the Catholic Church's official position, however, is that just because it's permissible to accept them doesn't mean that Catholics who accept them are off the hook. Now, when I try to explain this to my secular colleagues at Pitt, who may not share the same position on abortion as Catholics, I use the parallel case of Henrietta Lacks and the HeLa cell line. So if you're not familiar, Henrietta Lacks was a Black American woman who had advanced cervical cancer, was treated at Johns Hopkins, which at the time in the 1950s was one of the only major hospitals in the US that was treating Black patients, along with white patients, for cancer. And not just Henrietta Lacks, but a lot of patients who were at Johns Hopkins during this decade, they had samples taken from various parts of their body as well as their tumors for medical research without their consent. With Henrietta Lacks, what makes her special, of course, isn't just who she is, but what ended up happening with the samples that were taken. They ended up with an immortalized cell line, the HeLa cell line, which has been used probably more than the HEC293 cell line in biotechnology and medical research. And all of us have benefited from the HeLa cell line. The billions of dollars that have been made by various companies doing the research and producing biotechnologies did not for the longest time acknowledge Henrietta Lacks as the origin of that cell line, nor did they compensate or provide any sort of benefit to her family. Her husband, Day, says that more samples were taken during her autopsy without his proper consent. And so why do I bring up Henrietta Lacks? Well, my secular colleagues, many of them are uncomfortable with the fact that we have continued to benefit from the HeLa cell lines, not only because of the original injustice of not gaining a patient's consent to take parts of her body for medical research, but also, of course, the sort of systemic and structural racism that was present at the time, and maybe still is present in medical establishment, that probably largely led to keeping Henrietta Lacks' family in the dark about the use of her tissue, the derivation of the cell line, the millions and billions of dollars generated, et cetera. And so that can help motivate, I think, a little bit of sympathy for why some Catholics who may hold to the church's position on abortion may be uncomfortable with vaccines. That similarly, relied upon for their development a cell line that may have been illicitly acquired. And so the feeling that there is maybe some kind of complicity, the church says that, well, there might be some restitution that's still owed, Much like we feel with Henrietta Lacks and the HeLa cell line, perhaps with fetal cell lines, there's something that's sort of owed. Owed to whom, you may ask? Well, again, that's the Catholic position on abortion, the aborted fetus, and posthumous harm, insofar as the fetus was mutilated and carved into tissue and sent to labs to derive the cell lines. And so the Catholic Church says that while it's permissible to accept COVID-19 vaccines and other childhood vaccines that have this connection to fetal cell lines, like the rubella vaccine, the varicella vaccine, the hepatitis A vaccine, if you're in a really bad spot, one of the rabies vaccines, that there's still an obligation on Catholics who accept these vaccines to protest in some way. Now, it's unclear exactly the degree to which that protest needs to take place. It could be speaking in a forum like this and raising awareness about the origin of those cell lines. It could be writing a letter to pharmaceutical companies, which have sometimes been effective. So Sanofi Pasteur moved its manufacturing platform from one of the combination polio shots in 2020 from fetal cell lines to using animal cell lines. And so we've seen that vaccine manufacturers, while it might be expensive, can indeed switch platforms in some cases away from using fetal cell lines for development and production of vaccines. The church encourages some sort of objection or protest, talking to your family doctor, writing these letters, writing op-eds, et cetera. So there's some restitution that's still owed. So it's not the case that the Catholic Church just says, the vaccine is totally okay. No, you still owe something, for what the church takes to be illicit injustices committed against a human being, namely the fetuses who were aborted. In terms of vaccine mandates, the church has a lot less to say, so I'll be much more brief here. I will note that many Catholics have objected publicly to vaccine mandates. There are priests who are helping parishioners obtain religious exemptions for their places of employment. What's the deal with this? If there's not an official Catholic objection to these vaccines, all things considered, why are these religious exemptions still being sought? Interestingly, vaccine mandates, some of the very first political vaccine mandates were put in place by popes. for the Papal States during smallpox. So I like to remind my very traditional-minded Catholic friends that vaccine mandates were implemented in the Papal States by Pope Pius IX and some of his immediate predecessors for smallpox. And so in principle, the Catholic Church is not opposed to vaccine mandates. However, it does hold religious liberty to be a very, very important and central value in human life. And so one thought I have about religious exemptions is this. It may be a cost that we would be willing to accept, that people will still be able to get religious exemptions, even if there is the sincerity problem that Mike sort of gestured at. If you are a Catholic, for example, seeking a religious exemption, it looks like you do not have a substantive Catholic objection to the vaccine, given that the authoritative teaching body has sort of ruled that it is permissible to accept them. And so, does that mean that a Catholic should not seek them? Well, I don't know if a Catholic could sincerely seek a religious exemption on Catholic grounds. However, religious accommodation and religious liberty is arguably a constitutive value for a well-running democracy. In fact, in the United States, religious liberty was one of the most constitutive values for the founding of this nation. And so there's been a long, long history of religious accommodation in the law, even if it looks like on small bases it isn't promoting the common good or the community's well-being overall. Is that an acceptable cost in the case of vaccines? It might be, because what's the cost of eliminating religious accommodation and exemptions, right? Will that indeed increase vaccine uptake? It did not in California when they removed all non-medical exemptions. Michigan, on the other hand, just made it harder to get religious exemptions, or personal belief exemptions. To get that exemption for your child to attend a public school, you were required to attend a mandatory vaccine education session with a public health nurse. If you are willing to go through the hassle and inconvenience of going to a public health clinic and getting a 30-minute lecture from a nurse about vaccine safety, you get through that, then you can get your waiver and present it to the school and get your exemption. Michigan, in contrast to California, has seen greater uptake in childhood vaccines by making exemptions harder. This is not a Catholic view, it is my view, so I'll go ahead and attach that warning. I think that that might be the answer, that we can balance a really important democratic value, religious liberty, make it harder to obtain the exemption so you can sort of call out those who are really insincere. Because maybe the difficulty of accepting the exemption is a test of sincerity. However, I don't think that the government and I don't think employers should be in the business of forming sincerity councils. That is, groups of people who will evaluate the sincerity of employees or citizens who are asking for religious exemptions. So as a Catholic, I certainly wouldn't want a body to do that for me if I were requesting exemption for any sort of state mandate, whether it's vaccination or education or whatever. That might be then one way to sort of balance both the common good, but also this really important value of religious liberty. I also think that's most compatible with sort of the overall Catholic view of the common good, the role of the state in the protection of religious liberty. Finally, Mike, to answer your question, why are people still seeking religious exemptions? I went on Al Cresta's show, which is a major Catholic radio program on Ave Maria Radio and EWTN back in March of 2021, and he brought me in there for 2 hours to answer callers' questions about the vaccines. And I went there ready to talk about the Catholic Church's teachings and morality and where my bioethics at. I kid you not, I'd say 90%, we may have gotten one call in 2 hours about the morality of the vaccine or Catholic teaching. The rest of the calls were all scientific questions, dealing with misinformation. So, anecdotally and sort of armchair sociology, I suspect that most Catholics that object to the COVID-19 vaccines do not have a well-formed religious objection on the basis of their faith. I worry that Catholics who are objecting, by and large, are using faith as a proxy for a more fundamental social or political value that's grounding their objection. So again, that's my view. That's, of course, not a Catholic teaching, but that's the sense that I'm getting talking to Catholics who are still hesitant about the COVID-19 vaccines. I hope that wasn't too long, but that's sort of a broad Catholic perspective. Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to say, first of all, this has been a Christian-Muslim dialogue in the past, so I'm lucky, I suppose, as a Jewish person, to have been invited to be in the middle of sitting between a Christian and a Muslim. So, and also, by the way, during this month of Ramadan, and when we're about to celebrate both Passover and Easter as well, so I'm grateful for that. I can offer a Jewish perspective, not the Jewish perspective, because as you know, we have no pope. So there's a whole, there's no unity of opinions about really anything in the Jewish world. I can no more speak for all Jews than I could speak for all Christians or Muslims, so you don't want me to do that. I am a conservative rabbi, and the conservative movement of Judaism is, despite the name, we are the middle of the road, theologically speaking. We are the moderates of the Jewish world. But the essential guiding principles, which Michael pointed to earlier, are drawn from the Talmud, the major work of Jewish literature from which Rabbinic Judaism is drawn, and particularly a principle known as pikuach nefesh, the obligation to save a life when it is possible to save a life, and that is drawn from the source that Michael had on the screen earlier, as well as another which says, by the way, that pikuach nefesh, that this principle of saving a life actually supersedes, for example, very serious laws surrounding the violation of the Sabbath, or kashrut, dietary laws, or Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year in which we fast, and so forth. And in fact, really, you can really do anything, you can violate any law in Jewish life except for three in order to save a life, and those three are idol worship, inappropriate sexual relations, and murder. So really anything else. So in particular, the objection about, let's say, pork products involved with the production of the vaccine is really irrelevant, because in order to be able to save lives, certainly that should not be a concern. And Judaism also does not have the same objection to abortion that certainly the Catholicism does. And furthermore, we are obligated to take care of our bodies. We are given, as was pointed out, we are given our bodies, we must take care of them, and therefore we should not allow harm to ourselves. And so, for example, it is well known that some traditional rabbis have said, for example, that smoking is forbidden because that causes damage to your body, and you can't do that. So therefore, once again, that would actually should encourage the use of vaccines, because it should prevent people from hurting themselves and or others. So my rabbinic organization, the Rabbinical Assembly of the Conservative Movement, even published a halachic, a position paper on Jewish law called a teshuvah in our world, an answer in Jewish law that said that actually the use of vaccines is required for us. And whether, I don't know that so many conservative Jews know about that, but in my world, I have my congregation, Beth Shalom in Squirrel Hill, is about 600 families. I'm not aware of, with the exception of a couple people who have particular medical concerns about taking the vaccine, there is nobody who has rejected the vaccine. In fact, we have requirements that people who come into our building must be vaccinated and boosted. And so I have not, no one's come to me and said, but Rabbi, whatever. There really are, in the non-Orthodox world, no religious objections, and certainly in the population with which I am familiar, there is no vaccine hesitancy. Now, having said that, there are hesitant Jewish people, and in particular, the further right you go in the Jewish world to the Hasidic, or usually the preferred term is Haredi, very fervently Orthodox populations. Again, as was mentioned before about the population in Brooklyn, for example, where there is some vaccine hesitancy. By the way, percentage-wise, they constitute less than 10% of the Jews in America. In Israel, they constitute more like around 20%, but there is some hesitancy in that realm. But that is not really it is not drawn from a religious source. It is really actually because of classical distrust of government, because of historical anti-Semitism, which was a fact in Europe and to some extent in other countries as well, and also because there's a very strong feeling in that world that if the government tries to interfere with any of our traditions, we can object to that. So for example, if the government in this, there were actually, you may recall, there were some weddings that were taking place illicitly in Brooklyn in the depths of the pandemic, when everybody was supposed to be isolating, and to everybody's consternation, these groups of Haredi Jews were gathered and, together, and that was it was illegal. The police in some cases had to come and break them up. But in that world, they really feel like, well, this is our custom, this is the way we do it, and we're going to do it regardless, even if there is a public health concern. A related note, by the way, along this that you may be aware of is that, of course, Jewish people circumcise boys at the age of 8 days, and that is an essential requirement in Jewish life. There are some in that fervently Orthodox world that practice, that have as a part of the circumcision ritual, actually, and I'm sorry if this is a disturbing image, but in order to draw the blood out of the circumcision site, they actually put their mouth on the genital area of the child. And there have been deaths that have resulted of this because some of the practitioners of ritual circumcision have herpes of the mouth. Is that simplex 1? Is that what that's called? Yes. And so there have been a number of, not a number, but a small number of baby boys who have died in the New York area due to this practice in recent years. And the governing authorities tried to prevent this through various measures, and for various reasons they were not able to do so. But in that society, it was very important to them to continue this practice, even though it might put some children at risk, which is, again, to us, to most in the non-Orthodox world, is very shocking. We do not practice this in my world. So just we of course do practice circumcision, but we do not use that particular technique. So there is this historical lack of trust in government, and to some extent in mainstream media, as well as this idea that if the government tries to interfere with us, we're not going to let that happen. And so that's sort of what's going on there. I don't know really what the answer for that particular challenge is, other than I know that there's some data out there that suggests that religious leaders have some influence within that community. And so I think the best way to reach out to that community is through their religious leaders. They're not going to listen to me because that's just not how we work in the Jewish world. But for those of us who might have some kind of influence there, that could be one path. Also, of course, people do listen to in that community. They do listen to their personal doctors as well. They're physicians, and so that's another route for reaching people who are vaccine hesitant. One other small thing I just want to point out, that since I do work for a congregation that has we have many employees. We have people who work with children. Particularly, we have an early childhood education program. We have many parents who are very concerned about non-vaccinated teachers being in their children's midst, and particularly since kids cannot yet get vaccinated. We made the decision back in the fall that we would mandate vaccination for all of our teachers. Many of our teachers are not Jewish. We had one teacher who did refuse for religious reasons, and to my knowledge, she's Catholic, but belongs to some very maybe conservative parish within Catholicism, and she quit rather than submit to the vaccination. So that is a way that in my world we've seen this sort of kind of reaction. But it hasn't really happened amongst, shall we say, the Jews. So that's what we got from Congregation Beth Shalom.
Thank you very much. And my apologies to the rest of the panel for my tardiness this afternoon. When talking about vaccine hesitancy among Muslims and in Islam, first of all, I have to say that Mike on the far right, not that far right, but my far right on the panel over here, did a fairly good job representing Muslim positions, at least in terms of Islamic scholarship and Muslim bodies, and the main objections or the main issues that are studied among Muslim scholars when it comes to deciding whether or not the vaccine is halal or haram. And concerning the origin or the method of cultivating the vaccine with regard to fetal cells from aborted fetuses. This particular point, I'm just going to quote from the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America, which is probably the most recognized and also the most conservative of Islamic scholarly bodies in the United States of America. And their word on that subject was, despite that, the permissibility of using human organs and cells with certain conditions is the position of the majority of Muslim scholars and fiqh, meaning judicial councils. And so that issue alone, also stemming from the fairly nuanced position of Islamic law towards abortion in general, accounts for that issue, at least in of itself, not really being an issue for Muslims. The subject of porcine products and extract and gelatin as a stabilizer, as mentioned, Indonesia and also Muslim scholarly bodies in India as well, they voiced strong opposition to that. And however, of course, and again quoting but of course that's not present in every single one of the different vaccines that are out there. And to quote from the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America, or EMJA, they refer to the porcine products as najasa, which means impurities, which is something that is normally an impurity is something that we are forbidden from ingesting and that we should avoid at all costs, and especially when it comes to ritual prayer, cannot have on our person or in our place of prayer area. But they say that from their fatwa, or their verdict on this subject, that this makes the najasa, or the impurity, here happen only by proximity, in addition to being microscopic, and trivial things of this nature should be excused, particularly when the matter is about the necessity of protecting the people from this pandemic. But yet at the same time, there's also the caveat that it should not be used in the presence of alternatives, and that those who are overseeing the creation and testing of vaccines, that if they have the ability to, if they have alternatives, then they have a responsibility to seek out those alternatives. But when it comes to, so based on that, the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America and similar scholarly bodies throughout the United States and the Western world and the Muslim world in general, nearly all of them, I'm inclined to say all of them, but I can definitely say that nearly all of them have deemed the COVID-19 vaccinations from whichever company has produced them as being permissible, if not recommended. And some might even go further in saying that it's highly, highly recommended or even obligatory, just because achieving herd immunity through vaccination is far more preferred over achieving herd immunity through mass, making sure that everyone are letting the virus spread naturally and affecting whomever it affects. But when it comes to vaccine hesitancy and rejection of the vaccine, there's in the Muslim scholarly world, I've only seen, and again, just like among our Jewish colleagues, there is no hierarchy, so we do not have a top-down system. There is no pope in Islam. And so because of that, my own knowledge of different groups and different legislative bodies in this manner is a bit limited, but nonetheless, on social media especially, and among Muslim social groups, and of course the way that we can share information among ourselves, there has been some groups that have made a lot of noise in this regard ever since the beginning of the pandemic, one specifically from South Africa, And then also, in the United States, a scholar, a lecturer in California is also very vocal. But one thing that both of these entities have in common is a long history of association with certain political, socio-political talking points that are, often identified with certain media outlets. And so, and along those lines also is the, and so similarly, just like that, with the curtailing or the using religion as a proxy, I think was an expression I heard previously, that is similarly being used when it comes to justifying rejecting the vaccine. Now, I'm going to actually just quote from the American Muslim Jurists Association and just their points about why the vaccination should be taken by Muslims. And then I'll also summarize the position of their interlocutors. And so from EMJA, they say that, and this is, I'm just summarizing here, that first of all, the preservation of life being among the highest objectives of the Sharia law, and also because trivial things, or what we might call negligible amount, should be excused. And there is a certain prohibition in our religion of being overly technical about details of the law. And because the Creator wants ease for his servants, for his slaves, for his worshipers, and for us to avail concessions, and as well as to treat ourselves and to prevent illness from happening. And also using as forbidden substance other than pure alcoholic beverage as medicine is permissible according to the majority of Muslim scholars. And when it comes to medicinal matters, that anything which is likelier and likely to happen should be treated as if it is certain to happen, and anything which is imminent should be treated as if it is present. And from those bases, we have this concession, and that not only there is a permissibility to take the vaccine, but also that it is, in fact, recommended at the least. And, of course, when it comes to protecting and looking out for the greater good and repelling the greater harm. As for those individuals who are, for example, giving out templates for vaccine exemption, especially for vaccine mandates, the main principles of Islamic law that they invoke for this cause is the avoidance of doubt. And of course, you can imagine that what that doubt stems from is, of course, different sources of information about the content of the vaccine. Not necessarily about how the vaccine was originally produced or what the vaccine should ideally contain, but as if perhaps the suggestion that there have been nefarious hands that have added some things into the vaccine or into some vaccines, some samples of vaccines, before they reach the mainstream. And so that's one issue. Another issue is the right of autonomy or the right to refuse medical treatment. Medical treatment in general in Islamic law is permissible. It can only be obligatory when it comes to saving a life, and then also if a person is in such pain or their experiences make them have more of an, I guess we could say, an existential crisis and being ungrateful to the gifts of God. And so in case like that, then a person is obligated to seek medical treatment to ease their pain and ease their conditions. But otherwise, medical treatment is permissible and in some cases recommended. As the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, said, to seek treatment, O servants of God, but do not seek treatment with what is forbidden. And so the general rule being to seek treatment as being something that is permissible or even recommended. And this is something that has of course, in the history of Muslim civilization, been a bit of a hallmark with the proliferation of hospitals called Barimistans in Muslim civilization, and of course even trial inoculations, vaccinations for smallpox being developed in the Muslim world in Turkey a couple hundred years ago. But when it comes to the actual reasons that individual Muslims might cling to justify their own rejection or hesitancy of the vaccine, we find that it really has little to do with pork or fetal stem cells or fetal kidney cells, whatever the case may be regarding that, but rather more to do with what we might refer to as conspiracy theory. And, for example, the censorship of skeptics and censorship of other scientists that might have voiced objections to the vaccine, and what we might even call, or the silencing of that other voice through mainstream media. And of course also the mistrust that many minorities have against something that is so universally touted by the government or by institutions where maybe the heads of those institutions have conflicts of interest. And so, members of the FDA or the CDC might have conflicts of interest here or there, and related to different corporations that they may have worked for, or even different philanthropists that they may be connected with. And along those lines, and I remember seeing one of the memes or one of the pictures earlier of protests mentioning something about Bill Gates in there. And and in one of the verdicts written by one of the this gentleman in California regarding the vaccination, he actually quotes Bill Gates in one of his TED Talks about reducing world population through vaccination and education. And so this is the suspicion that there is something within the vaccination that could lead to sterilization in a select few, and also and specifically the group in South Africa, their judgments of prohibition of the vaccination is based upon something called graphene oxide, which although they have a lot about it, but apparently about the magnetic effects of it, and within those who have been inoculated. But otherwise, what's fascinating is throughout the history of this vaccine debate in the last couple of years, the otherizing that has occurred among the population. And so before the 2020 election, when we were just on the cusp of getting a vaccination approved for trials and for what we understood to be mass production and availability for the masses. At this time, when the president at that time, Donald Trump, was touting this as being something great that's going to be happening very soon, and that he hoped that it would happen originally before the election, or at least before the year's end. But at that time, there were lots of folks on the opposite, or on the other political spectrum, that were voicing vaccine hesitancy. But then after the election, all of a sudden, things became switched. And so it really goes to show, in my personal opinion, that vaccine hesitancy is based far less on religion or religious justification, but rather based upon personal bias or where one gets their media from and the media that they find to be most accurate or aligned with their values. The point that ultimately that Abdullah Hamid Ali from California, in his vaccine exemption letter that he issues and the template that he allows other imams to use, it ultimately concerns autonomy and doubt, and that no one should be forced to take, or a Muslim should not be forced to take a vaccination or a medical treatment when taking medical treatment in Islam is merely permissible, and especially if they have doubts about that treatment, and that this would go against their own beliefs of their own autonomy. And that would essentially summarize that position without going into further details of different conspiracy theories and the like. So I think that hopefully summarizes my position, or at least my understanding of the Muslim world, and especially Muslims in the United States and their position towards vaccines of COVID-19.
Thank you very much, panel. I have a few questions here from participants who are not here. So just to echo their questions. The first one is mine anyway. Maybe I ask one after the other if that's going to help. The first is about the frequency for taking the vaccines, which, as we know, Shanghai is currently shut down as an effort by the Chinese government to stem the spread of the virus. Today, I learned New Zealand just opened its borders after 2 years of shutting it from everybody else. But first to Australians, who are their immediate neighbors, and they want to see a few weeks later if they can open it to the rest of the world, or people they want to welcome in who are not going to bring the virus into their country. Now, my question is, with the growth of the variants of the virus, and it sounds like each variant, the new variants seem to be more transmissible than the previous ones. And now the recommendation to take the vaccines. First, it was a 2-dose, and then we got a booster, and now there's a second booster. My question to the scientists is, what would be the frequency for taking these boosters?
I'll try that one. The short answer is we don't know. And I would hesitate to hazard a guess, because every time I have tried to make a prediction about this virus, it has proven me wrong. And I think a lot of virologists at least feel that way. What I think is probably going to be true is that we are going to continue to see variants. I think SARS COV2 is with us now. I will tell you what my hope is. My hope is that we don't necessarily have to boost every year, like perhaps we do with influenza. And the reason I hope that is that what we've seen is that despite all of this rapid change that's occurred with the virus, what we have gotten so far out of boosting has been a real improvement in the immune response. The boosting it's not just a matter of making more of an immune response, it's a matter of refining it. And that refinement that occurs in that process allows our immune response to actually better manage variants than had that boost not occurred. And I am hopeful, cautiously hopeful, that, you know, the run we've gotten out of the boost so far might take us a little longer than every year. But we're going to have to see. And that's where sort of I feel like there's this race between what the virus is off doing and what we are trying to do and are moving forward, then pulling back at mitigation and steps. And the short answer is I don't think we know how often the boosts will happen, but we know that the boosts help a great deal against the variants we've had.
Thank you. The second question is from a participant who is not here. The question is, as Catholics, the acceptance of vaccines developed through the usage of embryonic stem cells, while good, comes with the moral imperative to demand alternatives for such vaccines. Are there reasonable alternatives to for the use of HE293 in vaccine development?
We can all take a crack at it, I guess, yeah.
I don't know much about the difference online.
So the question is, are there alternatives to the 293Ts that could be used, or to the 293 HEKs? I'm going to hand wave. I think it depends. I think it depends on the virus. I think it depends on the platform. As Mike nicely mentioned earlier, you know, there are sometimes alternatives that can be utilized, but those cells are used for a very good reason. They have a good history, they do the job well, and they allow us to do things and study things in ways that we couldn't otherwise. That doesn't mean that there might not be some alternatives out there, but I think that's something that you take on a case-by-case basis, because the 293s work.
Yeah, one clarification too, I heard embryonic stem cell. Just to be clear, they're not embryonic stem cells. I think that's been a point of a lot of confusion. These are fetal cell lines that are more or less immortalized. Yes. They're not actually derived more immediately or approximately in terms of time from an embryo. There is embryonic stem cell research that does rely on cells that are extracted from blastocysts and young embryos more recently, and the derivation of those cells or the removal of those cells typically results in the destruction of the embryo, but that is not the cell lines that are being used to develop vaccines. Yeah.
Thank you. I have another question from a participant who is virtual, and the question is, what about mandates in various religions not to impose one's own views on others? I think this would be for the religious leaders here in our midst.
Is it possible to ask for clarification? I'm struggling to think of a religion that the wording was, okay, not to impose beliefs on others?
Yes.
Religious prohibitions against that?
Not to impose religious beliefs on others.
Yes.
Or vaccine beliefs.
Not to impose religious beliefs on the vaccine on others.
Not to impose religious beliefs of the vaccine on others.
Yes.
That might have something to do with the incident that I described about a non-Jewish employee at a Jewish institution, let's say.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, let me put it this way. We were not thinking about that from a religious perspective, rather from a public health perspective for the population that is coming into our building. But by the way, which is for that early childhood education program, it's only about half Jewish. The balance are a bunch of other folks from other traditions, and those parents feel very strongly that they want their children to be not around people who are unvaccinated at this time, given their vulnerability, and so we made that decision. I guess you could say, from our Jewish values, from the perspective of we care about the health of others and the greater good that Michael referenced earlier as well. But I don't know that we saw that as an imposition of our Jewish of Jewish law on others so much as exercising our Jewish values for the purposes of having the greater good for our population.
I think the last one I have here, actually, I don't think is one any of you can address because it's a question to the university authorities. But I'll just read it anyway. Hopefully, whoever sent this will contact the university authorities. It says, on February the 24th, 2020, the Catholic University of America issued a document called The Use of Biological Materials in Research Policy, in which they pledged to refrain from any research involving embryonic stem cell lines or primary fetal tissues. Now the question is, does Duquesne University currently have any such kind of document? If not, is there an important consideration, especially as we prepare to welcome the new School of Osteopathic Medicine? I will direct this to the president and his team. But
We'll show the president the entire
exactly. Yes.
Maybe sort of answer that, I think, in part. So any research that is conducted at Duquesne or any university has to go through a variety of checks and balances, including institutional review board for the use of human subject materials, animal care if it's use of animal materials. I would have to guess that the institutional review board at Duquesne University would, I don't know, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but to the best of my knowledge, there is no research at Duquesne using embryonic stem cells or using any fetal tissue. Okay. The med school? I don't know, is that? Again, I don't want to preemptively decide what an institutional review board would do in any particular situation. That's up to them, but
Sure.
I would be surprised if they would allow that. Whether there's an existing document, I don't know. I doubt it, but do you?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't think so. As you said, the IRB is very, very, good insight in what we use in our research.
Yeah.
okay. Well, on that note, what about a round of applause for all our speakers and presenters? Thank you so much. On behalf of those of us here and those at home and the organizers of the event, we appreciate your time and your research and sharing all your thoughts with us. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Happy celebrations to the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims. This is an amazing period. All right. Thank you all.